Well, greetings and welcome. Depending on what you've been looking at, this is either the ninth Revelation presentation or the seventh, one of the two. If it's on YouTube, I think it's the seventh. It's on podcast. We're probably two ahead there. And tonight I want to look into an important chapter for me personally. In growing up, my mother discovered her great aunt in the county home. And that great aunt had served as a missionary in Kowloon outside Hong Kong for some 30, 40 years. And she had been there during the invasion of Japan in the Second World War. This same aunt was also at Seymour's school in Topeka, Kansas, when the Spirit fell for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century. I might have told the story, but she was hiding in a closet when the Japs came to her orphanage, and they opened the door of the closet. You know, they were killing missionaries and putting them in camps and stuff and raping them, of course. And she prayed, "Cover me with your pinions," and they just opened the door, looked in, they didn't even see her, and left. So she escaped that particular terror. But here she was at 80 years old in this county home and blind, and like she had been discarded. Somebody that served a whole lifetime in mission. Nobody knew where she was, how she got there, anything else. So my mother retrieved her, and she spent the last 10 years of her life living with us. And she, of course, though she'd be blind and very feeble, she would want to hear the Bible read. And the main chapter that she wanted read was Revelation 12. I mean, all the time. We boys, we'd read it over and over again. There's a dirty little trick that I played, and I would come into the room and she'd say, "Watch that cord. Don't trip over that cord." So a cord going across the room. There was only one outlet in that room. And of course, what I did is pretend to trip over the cord and fall on the floor every time. And that was really mean. But I would read Revelation 12 again and again, and my brother too. I'm not sure why that was so important to her, maybe except that that chapter is about escape. And she escaped a pretty terrible fate in that county home for somebody that had served and had come home, and there was nobody there for her. She was the teacher of Ruth Heflin. I don't know if you ever heard of Ruth Heflin, a famous missionary, Pentecostal missionary. Nobody's heard of her. Okay, that's all right.
I've absolutely heard of her. I saw her for the very last time she spoke. We were privy to go to the Ashland, whatever, Virginia. We lived in Williamsburg at the time, and we were privileged to be there the last time she delivered a message.
Oh, she was a genius. Wow. That's right. Well, she took over the orphanage for Aunt Myrtle when Myrtle had to retire due to her blindness. And I have a picture of them someplace here at that ministry, that orphanage in Kowloon. And Kowloon has been spoken of as the world's trash heap. In one of Charles Kraft's books on deliverance from demons, he likens the body to the city of Kowloon. He says that one shanty is built on top of another, till their size of near skyscrapers, and the water is always dripping off the buildings there, and there's trash everywhere and rats everywhere. And it's like the trash can for China. So the rats can smell the trash from Kowloon, and they just come to dinner. His theory was if they would clean out the trash, then the rats would have no reason to come there. That makes a lot of sense to me when it comes to demonic deliverance. Mark Rutland had said that the best way for a person to not become infected by demonic distractions is to keep the Torah. And he's a Methodist at the time, but very famous missionary pastor, Mark Rutland. That does make a lot of sense. If you can keep the inside clean, the rats really don't want that. They're looking for food. They're looking for emotions. They're looking for sin and filth in your life to revel in and to keep themselves alive. And when there's none left, then they have to go. I think maybe the next time somebody wants to do deliverance, it might be a good idea to get the person, insofar as they can, to keep the Torah and to clean themselves up before even trying, because they come out of a deliverance even successfully. Back they'll come. So let's take a look at the text. I think that I've got Revised Standard Version tonight. This is a very, very historical section. Almost everything in this section can be tied directly to a historical occurrence or a reference in a primary witness. And a great portent. Port comes, the French word is port, means door. A doorway appeared in the sky, in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. We interpret the woman, of course, as the true Israel. The true Israel. There's a true Israel and there's a false Israel. Just like you see in Proverbs 7 and 8, you've got a true, righteous woman of learning, wisdom, and you've got the false one across the street. Come on in here, boys. Let's have some fun. She's clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet. In Georgia, I was sitting at looking around at, what's the name of the gardens up? The Callaway Gardens one day. And I looked at the sky, and sure enough, the sun was in one position here, and the moon was in another position here. And of course, it made me think about this. What's the sun and moon got to do with true Israel in the sky? And of course, if you look at it like the text said, she is in a birthing position, especially for those days. The birthing position was something more of a sitting posture than today, a sitting posture. So some exegetes try to really make this complicated using the constellation Virgo and some of the other ones to try to prove when Yeshua was born, because they say that this also represents Mary, which that was, I was told that in the Catholic seminary, that this was Mary. I had a little bit of a problem with that, of course. But to be clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, it reminds me of the passage in chapters 2 and 3 about those that say they are Jews but are not. A true Jew passage. Because, of course, in those days, the people of the true Torah, they kept the Zadokite calendar. It was a solar calendar. You may know that there were at least 4 calendars going at that time. The Sadducees used lunisolar calendar from Greece. The Pharisees used a lunar calendar from Parthia, because they were Parthians. They originated in Parthia. And the Essenes used the original Zadokite Davidic calendar from the Temple period. And that changed about 200 BC with the assassination of the last Zadokite there in the Jerusalem temple and the taking over of these false Zadokites that we call Sadducees, both coming from the same word, Zadok or Zedekiah, righteous people. The Sadducees comes from the Greek version, Sadiq. The Zadokites come from the Hebrew version, Zedekiah or Zadok. The calendar here we're talking about is the woman being clothed with the sun. Now, the moon is under the feet. We still have the idea today that something is under your feet. It's under your feet, if you get me. True Jews, false Jews. True Israel, false Israel. The only calendar that was used in true Israel was a Zadokite solar calendar. The rest of them followed a different calendar. That might be one of the reasons that we get the hint in the Gospels over and over again that Yeshua was not properly keeping the Sabbath. It was probably because he didn't keep the same Sabbath as those. The Zadokite calendar has the Sabbath on what we call Saturday every week. It never changes, whereas the Sadducee calendar changed. There's discussion about this, whether it changed every month, every 3 months, or with the solstices. And they would start again with the week. So you might go 6 days at the end of one quarter, and then there's the first day of the week, and go 7 days then. Whenever the first day of the week started, not necessarily on a Sunday, that's where they would count their week. So I'm thinking that, like some of them do today, every quarter, the Sabbath would change, which would, as you know, if you ever try to follow that calendar, it wreaks havoc with your job. I don't see how the people at that time, if they were working for others, most of them were working for themselves, though, I suppose, could possibly keep up with a calendar like that. And it's much harder today to do that. Whereas the Zadokite calendar, it's just about perfect in all its ways. The moon is under the feet. On her head, a crown of 12 stars. We heard about that earlier. We've gone through chapters 7, 8, 13, 14, 17, chapter 1, 6. So we've gone through quite a few chapters. We can be pretty blatant about this now. We've got an awful lot of the symbolism down. Now, she was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth in anguish for delivery. The Neronic persecution started in 66. At that time, Jews and Christians in Rome were pretty much indistinguishable. As we talked before, Nero needed a scapegoat in order to blame the burning of Rome on. So many people killed, so many people out of life, so many jobs lost during that time. But of course, in Rome, it's only going to hurt the lower class, because in Rome, there was typically just two classes. There was the upper crust and there was the lower crust. And there was populated by 70 to 75% slaves. Slaves. How in the world did they keep from having slave uprisings when that's the height of the population there? In fact, there were so many slaves at this time, slaves were hardly worth anything. And when they started taking the Jews off as slaves, Vespasian sold them in the droves for next to nothing. You could get yourself a slave for nothing, and even some of the poor people began to acquire Jewish slaves. They took away the temple treasures, of course. The temple treasures ended up being used to build the Colosseum, where Jews and Christians were tortured and died, and they manned the Colosseum with Jewish slaves. In fact, today, even as they still excavate Pompeii, they're finding Jewish graffiti there and even Jewish Christian graffiti there. One a particularly interesting place for graffiti in Pompeii was the toilet. That is the slave's toilet. There's all kinds of graffiti on the walls of one slave toilet they found that was not only Jewish, but had Jewish curses in it against the people that had enslaved them. So, you know, they hadn't been around long. And Vesuvius, of course, happened in 79 at the end of Vespasian's reign. So we have a true Israel with the child. Now, the child, of course, is the Messiah. And the cries and agonies and anguishes here of delivery is symbolic for this Neronic persecution. We have a couple letters from, well, we got two letters from governors of provinces, and one of them goes to Trajan, who ruled just before the second revolt, and that was from Pliny, who asked Trajan, now that so many of these Christianoi are being brought in and accused, should I just kill them all? What should I do with these? And Trajan did reply, understanding that in that day, if you turned in one of the Christianoi, you got to keep their property. So you got neighbors, you want a little farm? Let's get rid of the neighbors, turn them in. They had to renounce Christos, and they had to pour out libation to the emperor's statue. This might have something to do with that, the emperor being every place in a hologram, as they used to say, in that other place, in Revelation 13. He was every place. Statues of him were taken around for people to come and venerate in order to prove themselves not believer. And once again, every time I have to bring up the thought about the more orthodox Christians, the Jewish Christians, and the Gnostics, that the Gnostics did not feel there was anything wrong with going and bowing to the emperor, renouncing Christ, because their belief was that Christ was a spirit anyway and not a real man, and pouring out to the emperor because, hey, they could walk away, go right back to their belief, go right back to their evangelism, and why shouldn't they? Whereas we see bishops like Ignatius, who writes letters on his way to Rome, perhaps to be sacrificed there as a bishop that would not, well, let's say a bishop that got caught. And as he goes to Rome, he writes a short letter to all the different churches of his parish. A bishop has many churches to oversee. And one of the things that he brings out is to resist renouncing Christ and doing the libation to the emperor or whatever they want, so you can die a martyr. You can die a martyr. That was a special way to die, that you would go straight to heaven, as it says in Revelation. These saints, 144,000, that died, went straight to a particular place to wait for vengeance and then be loosed from that place to go with Messiah to get after those who had imprisoned them or killed them there. I'm not so sure it was the Romans. I think that the ones that Messiah promised to avenge They were being avenged against the Jews. Last week we talked about the first horseman. And my contention is that is Messiah. But I'm about alone in that because they all say, how can that be Messiah and Messiah coming to fight against Israel? Very easy to explain. He comes to oversee the day of Yahweh, day of destruction. Let's see here what else we got. Another portent. Behold, Idu, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems upon his heads. We've already explained that from 2 other chapters, 17 and 13. The red dragon is defined here pretty soon as the devil. Kind of leads us to the story about, in Matthew, about Herod the Great going after all the children in the region of Bethlehem. Herod might be a substitute for this red dragon, if indeed this revelator knew about that particular occasion, and it seems like he probably did. That may be one of the earlier portions of memories that comes into Matthew. I think we were talking about that on the phone, Rich. You're a Matthew primist, and I think that there's some of the earliest texts in there, especially portions that had been originally written in Hebrew, that are still readable in there. If you can dig them out, maybe Matthew 5 through 7. It's always thought that Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 were interpolations, the story of the Christ child. And
yes.
Do you think they are?
I'm 85-15 on that. Yes. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm 100-0 on much right now.
Well, Luke in particular.
Sure. Well, Luke was the latest. Yeah. I mean, you're saying at least in the 90s, I put it at 115 AD, and obviously all the Greco-Roman mythology and archetypes in there.
You put Luke at 115?
Earliest 115, yeah.
Okay. That's good. I say 90s just because in the Acts he uses so much stuff from Josephus. So I guess what I'm saying, the earliest
right
was 96, something like that.
Right.
All right. Let me see. 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 heads of the beast, the 10 horns, the provinces, 7 diadems, the fullness of power, universal power upon the heads. The 7 heads are the 7 of the 8 emperors that were mentioned in chapter 17. The 10 horns, as I mentioned, were provinces that lent their support to the army of the beast, and 7 diadems upon his heads, the crowns. But understand that whoever the heads represent are in this sense considered to be possessed by the spirit of the dragon. They're possessed not only by the devil himself, but probably also by lead poisoning. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. Pretty obviously a reference to the fallen angels of Enoch and some of the other passages. Takes them down with his tail, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. Can you see that scene in your mind? It's rather disgusting if you consider the birthing position that they used primarily at that time and where the dragon would be waiting. So it's just a disgusting thought to me. She brings forth a male child. And here we have an allusion to Psalm chapter 2, an imperial psalm, one who's to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to Elohim and his throne. Messiah. Psalm 2 is very good to remember during this time because it's a prophetic psalm, very prophetic, and it's fulfilled. And it's mentioned various places in the scripture, so one might go take a look at that if you're studying this at all. So she brings forth a child. The devil's not able to devour that, thinking of the devil as Herod the Great this time. The child is caught up through his crucifixion and death. This whole revelation is full of blood. The blood of Messiah, the slain lamb, the wounded lamb, red, scarlet blood, the blood of the martyrs. I don't know how people can keep any kind of canon of scripture if they cannot understand that the entire canon is based on the blood sacrifice. Like you, Barbara Ray. Start from the beginning, go to the end. It's all one particular plan that requires that to be done. And this book especially, one of the reasons why it was so disputed in the early days is because of the theme of war and blood. Oh, got a chat here. Gotta run. Okay, Rich, you're gone. Yeah, Barbara. Yeah, we've only been arguing about that, 5 years now? And the woman fled to the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by Elohim. Well, Barbara, you're just wrong. I'm right. Stuck in my thumb, pulled out a plum, and said, "What a good boy am I." Nobody knows for sure. We've got to allow for differences of opinion in these highly symbolized passages. So this fleeing into the wilderness, this is a historical occurrence I'll read to you about here, where she, the woman, true Israel, has a place prepared by Elohim, a place of safety, a place to be nurtured for 1,260 days. Later on, it talks about she had other children. These, of course, were those who were to be martyrs who escaped. Oh, shoot. I wanted to play you part of a historical fiction that I did. I probably will do that at the end. Yeah, because it illustrates it real well. The chasing. Can you imagine people that were in Jerusalem, Nazarenes, even if they could get out, how could they transverse Palestine? Romans were everywhere. Zealots were everywhere. And both sides would kill them unless they had some special kind of passage. But you remember in the Olivet Discourse, which I told you was fulfilled in the Revelation, that Yahshua said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the hills. There were some caveats to this. Pray that it's not on a Shabbat. Pray that you won't be pregnant at that time, not able to go, because it'll be your last chance. This is technically called the flight to Pella, which I want to talk about right now by taking you over to another page. And we'll talk about something completely different for a minute, and that is Damascus. We have a text that was tentatively named the Damascus document in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it tells us some of the history of the so-called Essenes, who called themselves the Way and the Children of Light, just exactly the same words used in the New Testament to describe those who followed Yahshua. And one of the most amazing things about Damascus and the correlation between the Essenes, so-called, and the New Testament believers was what Damascus means. The word means dam, skus, that is bloody cup. And of course, we remember the Last Supper formula and the shocking things that Yeshua said to the few that were there: unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Damascus, the bloody cup, more properly in the land of Damascus in the scrolls. That's the way it's usually set out. In the land of Damascus, we have this place that was supposedly a good place for them to go because it was safe. And do you remember, Paul was going to Damascus to try to persecute these people more. And the Nazarene Acts tells us that when he had come and assaulted James and those that were going to be baptized on the temple steps, that there was an exodus of people out of Jerusalem. And then it talks about the enemy, who we consider to be Paul, because it says then he got letters from the high priest, Caiaphas, to go after these people. He's going to Damascus to track them down. We get a little story about this. I think, I don't know, it's in Acts or maybe in one of Paul's letters. I'm not sure. He talks about, no, it's in the letter. He talks about going to Damascus. Wasn't that the place where he was let down in a basket? Or am I getting that wrong? He goes to ferret out the believers to Damascus, and he ends up going out by a basket because he was so persecuted there. Why is that? To me, it is obvious that Paul is a Herodian. He tells the people he writes to that he is a Herodian. In Romans chapter 16, he talks about his kinsman, Aristobulus, and Herodian, the littlest Herod, there. So he identifies with this upper echelon of appointed family to the kingship by Rome. And in fact, if you can follow his genealogy, you'll find that Paul is, let me see, 1, 2, 3. He's the grandson of Salome, the sister of Herod the Great. I have that genealogy. This means that Paul probably was not a poor little tent maker. And when in the Acts Paul approaches King Agrippa II, it's like he knows him. Of course, they probably had Christmas dinner together. No big family reunion for Easter, and got together at the table and saw each other once a year. Of course, King Agrippa II, who was 17 years old, knows Paul and probably looked up to Paul as one of his forebears and one of his cousins once removed. So At this particular time, Herod, the next Herod, no, the one before, Herod Antipas. I'm going to put your mind on him for a minute. You remember the wife that he took from his brother, or I should say half brother. That was Herodias. He brings the wife down from Rome, while he sent his wife on a vacation to Machaerus, the mountain fortress out down by the Dead Sea. He sends his wife down there to be held. He goes to Rome, picks up Herodias, his brother's wife, and marries her illegally. And besides, that was Herod's niece. This is something really frowned on in the community rule of the Dead Sea Scrolls. No niece marriage, but Herod's every generation did. Sometimes they married two nieces. What that has to do with this is that, see if I can get this right. Herod Antipas brings Herodias back down to his capital city, I think Caesarea, lives with her like a husband and wife, and his ex-wife is in Machaerus being held. But who is this ex-wife? The ex-wife, I almost got her name. I don't, though. Is the daughter of the king of Damascus, who's another Herodian. So what happened over this, when King Aretas of Damascus found out what Antipas did, he summoned his army and he called a war against the Herodian troops. And so they're out there fighting in the wilderness, Herod and Aretas. And where's Paul? A Herodian? He's in Damascus, same time. Now, what's Paul doing in Damascus? It doesn't make any difference what he's doing, but I can tell you one thing. He wasn't let down in a basket for doing good. I am positive. He gets in the walls of Damascus. He was a well-known figure. He is identified, and he has to run for his life because the king there, who's also a Herodian, is fighting Paul's cousin out in the wilderness. King Aretas won. King Antipas did not win, but he kept Herodias, and he went into exile in Egypt and had to be succeeded by Agrippa. Now, this is the most amazing thing that Paul, I can't remember what was said about what is Paul doing in Damascus, but looking for Nazarenes. And Paul has to be let out of there after a riot down out the side in a basket to save his life. That's an incredible connection here. I don't know. Is it important for theology? By golly, it is. Yes. Why haven't we heard this all these years in churches or Bible colleges or any place else? Why? Well, if you think about it a while, consider the woman clothed in the sun and the babe being born and Paul and all this, you'll see a lot of significance here. It's more than just synchronicity. Because the writers of Luke and even Paul, they hint at certain things. They hint at things that if you can connect a few dots behind, you're going to get the real story. So Damascus is mentioned throughout the Acts and the Dead Sea Scrolls as a safe haven for Nazarenes and other Zadokite groups. If you're a friend of the Herods, you're no friend of mine. I'm sure Aratus was thinking this way. These guys were allowed in Damascus. In fact, the more conservative movement of the Nazarenes grew up in Damascus. Today, it's still called by scholars the Damascene Assembly, as opposed to the more liberal, the Antiochian Assembly of Paul and Barnabas. Scholars tell us that Damascus, Bloody Cup, is not necessarily the city in Syria, because there's no reference to that city as being friendly to Zadokites or Nazarenes or anything like that. With the exception, I wrote this part about 10, 20 years ago. I've found connections since then. So at this time, I say I have long suspected that Damascus was a code name for the town Pella. This was the place that those who were under the leadership of Simon the Zealot, Shimon Cleopas, the brother or cousin of Yeshua and James, was the head of after 62 AD. James was the head of it. He was, hands were laid on him as a successor to his brother Yeshua. And James, as you know, was thrown off the temple in 62 AD. About the same time we're talking about. And the one that succeeded him was the other brother. This was a dynasty, just like Tabor calls his book, The Jesus Dynasty. A darn good book if you're just coming into knowledge. It's pretty simplistic, but it's good. It shows you how the dynasty of the Jesus family ruled over the Zadokite movement and the temple crowd for a number of years, despite the fact that they were not allowed to rule. The people loved them so much that the people trusted them and not the temple priests. So Simon Cleopas, I believe, was the head of the Jerusalem assembly in 70. And it's disputed a little bit here, but the first emperor after Nero, Galba, he was only in for 6 months. He was an old general from Spain. Remember, he was the one that would not pay the Praetorian Guard, and they killed him. But he called a halt to the battle in Jerusalem. And he had it announced that anybody that wanted to come out now would get safe passage out. This happened again during the siege of Jerusalem when Titus was in charge. Josephus reports the very speech that Titus had, that he interpreted, where another chance for people to come out if they would. The only problem with people coming out was that those tyrants that were inside of there would not let anyone out. If you tried to get out, you were killed immediately and stacked up for your body to rot in the Holy of Holies. You were killed. So we have tradition to tell us that there was a band of Nazarenes that got out. And I fictionalized this in order to try to make it more real. Look at this map now. This is a discovery I made here. Maybe I can get this a little smaller. I don't know. Save it, copy, search. I'm just going to have to show it because it's on a web page. Look where Jerusalem is. Fighting going on there. Pella is right here. Look what, if Pella was the city they're going to, look what they'd have to go through. Over mountains, through troops, over the Jordan River to get to Pella. But look at this. Damascus. A perfect line. A perfect line. And this whole area was called the land of Damascus. And not only that, but here's a town called Gadara. New Testament tells us that this was in the Decapolis, the 10 towns. Gadara was one, Pella was one, and there were 8 more. Scythopolis, that's called Bethshean now. And Nazareth is close by. This was the hangout for these Nazarenes and zealots for the Torah. We read that several times in the church historians. Nazareth, Kokabah, Canaan. And right here was a large capital city called Sepphoris. It was the number 1 city of the Greeks and Romans. There weren't any Jews in there. They lived in Nazareth, and they had to commute 4 miles up the road to the big city. But that is an incredible thing, a perfect line. If you go to your maps, in your Bible maps, and you take a ruler and you connect the dots of the 7 churches of chapter 2 and 3, and you connect Patmos to that to make 8 dots, then you take your ruler and follow where the arrow takes you, because it's making an arrow or a triangle. Follow it straight up, you're going to go to Rome, right on the nose. What a coincidence. But as far as Pella, you probably already know that this place was prophesied to be a safe place through the wilderness. I'm going to put another screen up here just in a minute, but I need to go just a little more here. So the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by Elohim, in which she's to be nourished for 1,260 days. That's the extent of the Neronic persecution. I said there's not only 7 years that's spoken of in Revelation. 7 years of the war, yes, but there's actually 3 different mentions of 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. And if we tack on the 3rd mention and make it 10.5 years, it takes us down to the beginning of the Neronic persecution and the burning of Rome. War arose in the sky. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. I mentioned the last 2 weeks that as many as 2 million people saw this battle in the sky with chariots and horsemen. And even the pagan Roman historian Tacitus reported this. Remember, there were perhaps as many or even more than 2 million in that city, locked into that city, with the population going down, down, down every day through starvation and the deaths for the infighting. Jerusalem broke into 3. It's 3 factions when there was an earthquake there that happened. And the fight was shown with lights, and lights came down on the altar, and lights came down on the temple. I don't know if it was UFO, but what was reported was actual prodigies there. And a cow gave birth to a lamb, and some other things like that, signs that they would see. But everybody saw the war in the sky. But they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in the sky, in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down. That ancient serpent was called the devil and Satan and the deceiver of the whole land. He was thrown down upon the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. I heard a loud voice in the sky saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our Elohim and the authority of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our Elohim. My goodness, this could even be Nero, because he did come from on high, and he was thrown down to the earth. And if you can stand this, the one that helped him escape, again, was Epaphroditus, one of the secretaries of Paul. Now look, they have conquered him by what? The blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. They no longer have to just give the testimony of Messiah and his death, but now they have their own. Because the way these people conquered the 144,000 was through their death, because they loved not their lives even unto death. Last week we talked in detail about 144,000. How did they become sealed? Well, the seal was put on their head before they were executed or died in the war. And then they went directly up in a rapture to the mid-heaven to meet Messiah in the air, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:5. Yes, I believe in the rapture. I believe it already happened. I believe that Revelation makes it very clear that it already happened. And then they all come down on Mount Zion to oversee the destruction of Jerusalem. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwell therein. But woe, speaking of the sealed right here, but woe to you, O land and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he'd been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had borne the male child. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle. Now, here's an interpretation that you won't hear anyplace. Throughout this book, eagle and eagle's wings have a twofold meaning. One of those meanings goes back to the Psalm. He will lift you up on eagle's wings, the Psalm of salvation. And the other meaning, and especially in 4th Ezra, that prophecy about the same thing, the eagle speaks of Rome. When Galba gave the call for anyone to come out of Jerusalem that would, I told you he offered safe passage. Now, do you remember when Paul went to Britain? Paul now, and he came back through continental Europe, and he preached at all the Roman garrisons, according to Acts 29. Who was it that gave him safe passage? It was a Roman legion. Paul traveled with an escort of 250 men. Yes, Roman legions. He goes to Britain, before that Spain, then he comes down through Belgium, goes through Gaul, Germany, ends up in Switzerland, where he gives a speech and something miracle happens. But it's told in Acts 29, the Sonini manuscript, that he is accompanied by the legions of Rome. What do you think about Simon Zelotes or Simon Bar Cloppa, who is able to get out with his Nazarenes out of the city for safe passage through the great eagle and get them to the hills around Pella? I haven't explained Pella yet, but I will here to end this up. To place them where she is to be nourished a time, times, and half a time. That time did come to an end. And we have reports of the Nazarenes coming back into Jerusalem again and living there throughout the rest of the century until persecutions began again somewhere around the beginning of the 2nd century, at which time Simon Bar Clopas was crucified, coming up to the 2nd rebellion. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. Go back to Old Testament prophecy. What is the river of water chasing somebody? That has to do with people and troubles and armies. Go back to the book of Joel and see. These people did not have an easy trip. I'm sure they had an escort for a time, but there was a time when they would get to the place where they're on their own. Yet the land, Eretz Israel, came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river which the dragon had poured from its mouth. Literally, we're not sure what that means, except that the land can also mean people you come upon, what was left of the people there, that are friendly and nurture you. Of course, the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to Israel and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Where's true Israel today? I don't mean to be haughty, but my friends, that's us. And why there aren't 1,000 people listening to this, I know I'm not skilled, but this is an important message that true Israel, who doesn't realize she is true Israel, ought to be listening to. On those who keep the commandments of Elohim and bear testimony to Yahshua. Well, you notice those that bear testimony to Yahshua in this country don't get any persecution whatsoever, because Jesus is all love. But those who keep the commandments of Elohim, now that's another story. And they're being persecuted all over the world. The other night, I talked to a fellow in Malaysia. I've been talking to people in Africa, Malaysia, Philippines lately, because I want to know how Torah-centric believers are getting along over there. Well, this guy I talked to, his name is Hanik Shahan, and he is on Facebook. You might want to make friends with him. He had just come into Malaysia, which has the highest population of Muslims in the entire world, from Pakistan. Why? Because as a Torah believer and a man who taught Torah there among those people in his home country of Pakistan were under such persecution and threats of death all the time. He had to get his family out of there and bring them to the only place that would harbor them, and that is Malaysia. And even now, Hanif cannot go outside alone. It's against the law for him as a person that the UN has brought over there to save him from persecution. The law says that he's not allowed to ever be outside until they find out whether they will grant him asylum or not. Okay, go into Pella real quick. And I would still, if you want to hang around, I would like to play a little bit of the fiction. Habeas Corpus is the name of it. Now, why Pella? Oh, we don't really know why. What we do know is the prophecy came. And I already mentioned one prophecy from the Olivet Discourse of Yahshua. Here's one that comes from Eusebius, Church History. I think he's 5th century, 4th century, not sure. But he's the one that wrote the ecclesiastical history of the Christian church up until his time. And he was the theologian for the Emperor Constantine. So, yes, that was 4th century. The people of the Church of Jerusalem, he writes, of course, this is going to be in churchy language, I'm afraid, were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it, to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which is called Pella. To it, those who believed on Messiah traveled from Jerusalem, so that when the holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea. And we're suspecting that was right in the midst of Galba or Titus's decree to come out. Epiphanius is a heresiologist. In his medicine chest, called the Panarion, the medicine chest for all heresies. Of course, our belief is a heresy to him because our belief keeps Torah. A Christian in his time would not keep Torah, because if they did, they would be doubting the power of the blood of Jesus. He writes, the heresy of the Nazarenes exists in Berea, in the neighborhood of Cilicia, southern Syria, and the Decapolis, in the region of Pella, and in Basanitis, and in the so-called Kokaba, which means stars, of course. But there it took its beginning after the Exodus from Jerusalem, when all the disciples went to live in Pella, because Christos had told them to leave Jerusalem and go away, since it would undergo a siege. Because of this advice, they lived in Perea after having moved to that place, as I said. Funny thing about this heresy called the Nazarenes. Did you know that Joshua was a Nazarene? He shall be called a Nazarene. And even the religion of the Messiah was a heresy. Even the religion Messiah kept was a heresy, until, of course, he was executed and shed his blood, and all of a sudden, don't have to keep Torah anymore. In fact, it's a sin. Epiphanius, again, in his Panarion, says this, for after all those who believed in Christos had generally come to live in Perea, in a city called Pella of the Decapolis, of which it is written in the gospel that it is situated in the neighborhood of the region of Batanaeus and Basanitis. Ebion's preaching originated here after he had moved to the place and had lived there. Now, Epiphanius thinks that the Ebionite movement, which primarily is Christianity without any supernaturalism, that Yahshua was born a mere man, and that when he was baptized, the Spirit of the Christ came into him. And when he died, the Spirit of the Christ left. That's an Ebionite. We have Facebook groups full of Ebionites who now I believe are heretics, I'm afraid. And so Epiphanius thinks that the founder of this sect, that was very evident at that time, was named Ebion. But you remember that in Hebrew, that word means, Ebionim means the poor. And isn't that who Yahshua addressed one of his Beatitudes to? And isn't that what the assembly called themselves in the book of Acts? And the priests of the Zadokite faith who were in exile, didn't they call themselves poor priests? They did. Ebion. This comes from Epiphanius as well. So Aquila, while he was in Jerusalem, also saw the disciples of the apostles, flourishing in the faith and working great signs, healings, and other miracles. For they were such as had come back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem. There it is. They'd come back and were living there and teaching after the 3.5 years. For when the city was about to be taken and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance that all the disciples by an angel of Elohim that should remove from the city as it was completely destroyed. They sojourned as emigrants in Pella, the city above mentioned in Transjordan. And this city is said to be of the Decapolis. Now, there's one little problem with Pella. Is anybody still here? Two people. Goody. Pella, as it's reported in Josephus, the Jewish historian that was there doing all this, and our main source, he said that in Pella, the Greeks and the Jews fought out a civil war there, and that the Greeks killed all the Jews in Pella. So why would they go to Pella? It talks about hiding in mountains and caves or in hills. In the hills around Pella, outside of the city, on the far side of the hills from the city, it's full of caves. Full of caves, marl caves, dirt caves, rock formations. I've seen it. And the thought now of those who believe in prophecy and believe what Epiphanius says about that, understand that they went into the caves there rather than going into the city. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about wilderness camps all the time, and the land of Damascus all the time. So not necessarily in the city of Pella where they probably get killed, but let the rocks and stones follow them and hide them. And they were hidden for 3.5 years there. And that's what I believe about it. But there are other prophecies that speak of Pella as being the place generally where they're to go. Now, I got 15 minutes, and I want to play something for you for 15 minutes. So hold until I find it. It's a recreation of what happened in Jerusalem after the decree that you could leave and be escorted out. And I will find it. Some of you have already heard it, but I've done numerous biblical fictional plays that I have recorded myself and put them up here about aspects that the scripture talks a little about, but I want to fill the blanks in. So what the scripture says can be interpreted on our level. So to dramatize that to some extent, well, it's much more instructive. And I think I have 17 of these 1-hour fictions. If you're ever interested in hearing them, I've got them all together in one place. They're interesting. And they're pretty exciting. As a matter of fact, you could listen to them and easily go to sleep. Maybe. You have to tell me if you can hear it, though. Let's see if I can share the screen, share the computer sound. Maybe that'll work. Let's see where this one is.
Pray that your flight may not be in the winter.
Okay.
Joshua is 70.
Yeah, this will get us there.
Joshua the Nazarene awakes in dark agony. His feet, hands, face, and
Can you hear?
chest are all afire with pain. Every joint's out of place. He remembers his ordeal now as the dead body slowly returns to life. Blood and fluids again start to flow. Oh, the pain! He wrenches off the shroud with a whimper. Unwrapping the turban, he lays it aside. I am the sign of Jonah. Yes, he remembers everything now. It's a long, stressful ordeal for him to roll off the cold stone slab, to swim through the spoiled vegetables piled on him, to roll off onto the bare stone floor. Naked, save for a loincloth, he sees the light of day, for the tombstone is split, and there in the changing room a fresh linen robe is folded, the priestly robe.
I've got to jump up. It's too long. I'm sorry.
Estus, the title by which Yeshua is known in Rome, is incognito.
Get a little higher. Oh, wait a minute. You don't want to listen all that long. Let me find the one that's a little closer to the end. Battery? I'm on battery? How can that be? I'm on battery. Everything's going haywire now. It's that great red dragon. Oh, we hate him. All right. Oh, let's see what's going to happen. Can you even hear me again? I'm sorry, I don't. Okay, I heard it, yes. My battery's running low. Well, this is weird. I'm going to have to conjure up again. That's not it. Where is it? Here we are. See what the length is. It's pretty big.
And so ends this installment of The Lost Years. For more of the same, Now this Longinus had served the 10th Legion in Jerusalem ever since he'd been captured in Germany.
Okay, we're getting close now.
Pray that your flight may not be in the winter.
Joshua is 70 years old. He's in Jerusalem living with his brother Shimeon Cleopas, who met him on the Emmaus Road after his resurrection nearly 40 years before. Joshua feels his body disintegrating. He was healthy for decades and feeble, then leprous. Now he is getting lighter and lighter. Matter is becoming energy. E equals mc squared. It's a wonderful thing. His body is vanishing as his spirit angelizes. It's important he be here right now, be strong for his brother's family and the assembly of Yahweh at Jerusalem. 5 legions of Roman soldiers surround Jerusalem 2 years earlier. They'd see the holy city leveled and burned. Inside the city, conditions are horrific. Many have turned to cannibalism, and the Jews were fighting each other for control of whatever meat was left. Might we not hear, quote, gallant men who were living close to the time of the Great Tribulation and who tell us mysterious histories concerning the siege of Jerusalem? We'll start with Kephah's disciple Clement, who may have been inside or outside those very walls of Jerusalem at this time. Clement writes, An evident proof of great mystery is supplied in the fact that everyone who, believing in this prophet who had been foretold by Moses, and being baptized in his name, will be kept unhurt from the destruction of war impending over an unbelieving nation. But those who do not believe will be made exiles from their place and kingdom, that even against their will they may understand and obey the will of Elohim. General Josephus, earlier of the resistance but now translator for the Roman general Titus, is definitely at the wall and very much involved in the assault against Jerusalem. He writes about an unexpected and fateful retreat of Roman allies.
It then happened that Cestius, the Roman legate of Syria, recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of any expectation of taking it, without having received any disgrace, he retired from that city without any reason in the world.
No reason in the world? Maybe the reason came from another world. Next we hear from Epiphanius, so-called church father and heresiologist of the 4th century. For when the city was about to be captured and sacked by the Romans, all his disciples were warned beforehand by an angel to remove from that city, doomed as it was to utter destruction. On migrating from it, they settled at Pella, the town already indicated across the Jordan. So it is to Pella, on the Damascus road, the disciples were told by the angel of Yahweh to venture. Now our last witness is Eusebius himself, church historian and theologian to the Roman Emperor Constantine.
Now this sect of Nazarenes exists in Berea, at Celesyria, and in Decapolis, in the district of Pella, in the Kokaba, or Basanitis, called Kokoraba in Hebrew. For thence it originated after the migration from Jerusalem of all the disciples who resided at Pella, the Messiah having instructed them to leave Jerusalem and retire from it on account of the impending siege. It was owing to this counsel that they all went away, as I have said, to reside for a while at Pella.
Yet there is no inkling that any in this embattled city would ever get out. How could they possibly? The gates were shut and barred and guarded, both inside and out, by violent men. But just then, there was another miracle. The decree of Nero's successor, General Galba, in Rome, was heralded by his counterpart, General Titus, who had surrounded Jerusalem and was squeezing it for all it's worth. Galba's declaration was astounding and a complete surprise to both friend and foe. These are the words of Galba's message.
By authority of Galba of Rome, before we utterly destroy your capital and everyone therein, those of the good faith, come out the Damascus gate and be free.
Galba was proclaimed acting emperor after the death of the Antichrist Nero. Believers in Yahshua within the walls of Jerusalem numbered to over 5,000. They were all ready for this because the angel of Yahweh, Yahshua the Anointed One, had predicted it a generation before.
When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies,
he warned,
flee to the mountains.
This was their chance, and with Yehuda, Yahshua's nephew, in